Today's show is sponsored by PricingWire. Think about all the time, effort, uncertainty, and everything else you are investing into the software solution you're building. PricingWire has helped more than 1,000 software and technology innovators like you take a proactive approach to both discover and get paid what you're truly worth. From early startups to Fortune 500 enterprises, across verticals and around the globe, PricingWire delivers easy-to-understand and actionable recommendations to guide your monetization and pricing strategy. If you want to avoid unnecessary challenges or costly regrets and prevent missing time-sensitive revenue opportunities, PricingWire can help. Just go to pricingwire.com and book a strategy session today. PricingWire helps technology innovators like you design the right offerings, better quantify and message value, set and change prices, select the right pricing metrics, or even decide if usage-based pricing is best for you. Why wouldn't you want to achieve your revenue goals faster and with more confidence? Learn more at pricingwire.com and start making meaningful progress today.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is good to be back with you this week. We are now kind of into the full swing of September, into the fall, at least for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. Kids are going back to school. Traffic's a little bit hectic with school buses and all that sort of stuff, but hope everybody's doing well. It is good to be back with you. Real quick, we're going to do a little bit of cloud news of the week, and then I want to hit on a couple more important topics than that. I want to congratulate Platform 9, Cloudcast alumni, just took another round of funding, $25 million to continue to do managed OpenStack and Kubernetes offerings. So continuing to see, especially around Kubernetes, especially to see more and more companies that are interested in managed Kubernetes offerings. So congratulations to the Platform 9 team. That's kind of all the cloud news I want to hit on this week, at least in terms of technology clouds. If you've been watching the weather at all, I know a lot of our listeners are in North America and some in Europe and all. You've probably been paying attention to the news. Just a massive, we've hit hurricane season, massive storm that is really doing incredible damage to the Bahamas, a lot of the Caribbean. I know many of you will go on vacation there. There's going to be massive amounts of damage. This Hurricane Dorian is unfortunately the largest storm on record, the largest storm to ever reach landfall, around 180 miles an hour, Category 5 hurricane. So I'm going to ask that if you are able, that instead of maybe spending a few bucks on a cup of coffee this week or something else, maybe you make a donation to the Red Cross or one of the other relief organizations. That area is going to have just massive amounts of damage. And if there's a way that the Cloudcast community can help out with that, it would be great. If you're able to reach into your pocket and help out, it's going to do a lot of damage here in the States. We'll be able to take care of that. But if you're able to make a donation, Red Cross is a great organization for that. I know there's many others that help as well. So if you're able to do that, that would be very, very kind of you. A couple other just quick notes and we'll wrap up Cloud News of the Week. First one, if you are in Europe and you are thinking about going to Velocity Conference in Berlin, which is November 4th through 7th, if you use the code CLOUD, C-L-O-U-D, CLOUD, you'll get 20% off your pass. So we're always happy to partner with the O'Reilly folks on that. And if you enjoyed our show from a couple of weeks ago from the folks at Learn on Demand Systems, they want you to try out an IT Pro Challenge for free by visiting learnondemandsystems.com/cloudcast, and you can try out one of the free IT Pro Challenges. I know there's been a lot of interest in that show and a lot of really positive feedback about that offering. So want to give you a couple of ways to save some money, go learn some new things, whether you're in person in Berlin or online with Learn on Demand Systems and IT Pro Challenges. So with that, we are going to wrap up Cloud News of the Week. Again, if you're able to make a donation, be generous. I know the folks that are going to be affected by this hurricane would greatly appreciate it. So with that, we're going to get to our interview. Very, very interesting show talking about kind of technical debt and the ability to manage when systems fail and how do we better manage those systems. So let's get to the interview. Today's show is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. It's optimized to make managing and scaling apps easy with an intuitive API, multiple storage options, integrated firewalls and load balancers, a new managed Kubernetes service, and much more. From predictable pricing to flexible configurations to world-class customer support, you'll get access to all the infrastructure services you need to grow your business. Plus, DigitalOcean's community provides over 2,000 tutorials to help you stay up to date on the latest open source software, languages, and frameworks. So to get started on DigitalOcean for free, with a free $50 credit, go to do.co/cloudcast. That's do.co/cloudcast. And we're back. You know, folks, obviously we talk a lot about technologies on the show. We talk a lot about new technologies, and people love that. But the byproduct of new technologies is it means things are going to change around you, whether that means you're learning new technologies or the people that you're working with, the process and the skills that people have may have to evolve and so forth. And there's always this trade-off that people have between, do we adopt new things because they're good for the business? Do we not adopt them because they seem hard? And we always try and go out and try and find some folks that live and breathe this and that are around it quite a bit to help us have some perspective on how do we deal with change, how do we deal with the business demand to go faster and the technology challenge of kind of trying to learn and what that means in terms of our thing. So very, very excited today to have Heidi Waterhouse with us, who is a developer advocate with LaunchDarkly. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So before we jump into kind of talking about this, give us a little bit of your background. You, as I look at some of the things you do, you get a chance to speak quite a bit at events, at conferences. It means you get to talk to people. And to a certain extent, there's a theme sometimes about talking about things are broken and how do we fix them. And so give us a little bit about your background just to kind of set the context of why you're interested in the things that you talk about in this context.
So it's a useful thing to know about me that I started in technology before Y2K. So if that's your formative technology experience, you're always sort of painfully aware of how taped together everything is. I spent 20 years as a technical writer, which is super exciting because that means that you get to learn all the nitty-gritty of the how and the why of software. And then I transitioned into developer advocacy because I was running out of exciting new things to document, and I decided to take the show on the road and talk to people about the things that I've learned over time about how systems work and how we can think about things fitting together like independently of a specific company or a technology.
Right. Yeah, and I've always found that the folks that do technical writing are typically very connected to the product teams that are building whatever they're building, and they have a very acute eye for trying to put themselves in the shoes of the end customer, the user of the product, the architect of the product. And so they do an incredible job of sort of, I don't want to say calling BS on stuff, but they kind of go, what the way you explain it to me doesn't make sense, or we together have to figure out a way to make this so that the person without deep technical knowledge can make sense of this. And so your perspective, I think, is going to be very, very interesting in this about the things we're talking about. Before we sort of dive into kind of the deeper topics, give us a sense of your day job is at LaunchDarkly. Give us a sense of what LaunchDarkly does, just so people kind of understand the space they're in around feature flags and trying to help do continuous deployments and so forth.
Right. So my off-the-cuff response is we do feature flags as a service, because feature flags are a really powerful tool that lets you control how software behaves after it's been deployed. And continuous deployment is a really powerful tool that lets you understand that software is living and breathing and active at all points. And the thing that has to happen for continuous deployment to be a reality is you have to be able to deploy, but not show people, broken code. Because if you can't push broken code to production, you're doing very fast iterative deployment. And so the idea of continuous deployment relies on being able to gate off some parts of your code so that it's not visible to everyone.
Right. And I think that's something that people are beginning to understand more and more. They're having to understand it more and more because we have these applications that are really composites of a lot of things. The experience is the thing that we think of as the application, but the experience is really made up of a lot of different things. And like you said, you've got to be able to put broken code out there. You've got to be able to put new code. You've got to be able to experiment with a small number of people and see if it does what it's supposed to do. And so it's a fascinating area in general. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you've been talking about lately, which I thought were very, very interesting, which is it's kind of around this idea that everything is a little bit broken, not massively broken, but it's always a little bit broken. And kind of what that means. We get a chance to talk to a lot of different people, sometimes kind of what I would call, end users or customers or the businesses using technology and then implementers. And there's so much that are coming at people these days, whether it's, microservices and distributed stuff and using the cloud as opposed to physical data centers. And it's creating this big shift in people having to go from, kind of like you said, earlier thinking, kind of maybe pre-Y2K days, or focus on uptime being the most important thing, to, this environment where things are constantly changing. Kind of give us a starting point. How do you start framing that conversation for people so that maybe the benefits of some of these new technologies don't seem so, I don't know, just impossibly difficult to make work or make them fit in their environment?
So one of the things that I tell people that always terrorizes them is that the plane that you use to get here has an error budget. There are always things wrong with the plane that you're on.
Yeah.
But not in core systems. And if the error budget exceeds a certain threshold, even if it's just like the latch on a luggage bin is broken, then you know something about the overall fitness of the plane and you pull it from service. Another example, we just finished watching the Tour de France. It's not like after 3 weeks of cycling, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers a day, these people feel good. Like, none of them feel awesome. They have sores, they have aches, and yet they're still operating at this elite level because they have trained to be able to do that past a capacity. Like, they are at a certain level, and they have an error budget in there where, like, oh yeah, I can keep riding with a broken rib.
Right. Yeah, and I think people, I don't want to say they forget that. I think in some cases they've either never experienced it, or the people around them have built, metrics or key performance indicators that kind of assumes perfectness. And I think that's a hard thing sometimes to kind of overcome if, like you said, you haven't lived around this world where you're like, yeah, we build in the fact that stuff's kind of broken, at least in different places, and we figure out how to manage around that.
I really think this is something interesting that the SRE community has done for us, site reliability engineers, where they talk about error budgets and they talk about performance contracts, where they're like, we're going to give you this many nines. And the important thing to me when we think about this is that we remember what Charity Majors said, which is nines don't matter if your users aren't happy.
Right.
Nines are an indicator. Reliability is an indicator of system stability and therefore user happiness and therefore our ability to make money. But if we hang up on the metric, then we're not actually doing the work to make sure that the people are happy.
Right. Yeah. And as we've learned over time, any metric can be gamed. Anything that, has a potential, benefit, well, not benefit, but like somebody is measured against it, people will find ways to sort of game the system and so forth. So yeah, like you said, just relying entirely on that number and building against that number doesn't necessarily mean you're building to the thing that drives satisfaction, that drives profitability, that drives, whatever the bigger picture is.
Right. And the cool idea to me about error budgets is not only that you have this room to have problems and to have intersections and things that you didn't expect, but you're expected to use them. Like, if you get through and you haven't used any of your error budget, then you're not experimenting enough. You're not pushing forward. You're at a stable state. And so a good SRE manager will say, why haven't we used any of our budget?
Right. I want to dive into that a little bit more in a little bit later in the show. Let's start a little bit earlier. So, on one hand, if we were to draw this out as a spectrum, sort of, you've got certain mindsets within companies that are very 5 nines kind of, or however many nines centric, and they have a tendency to want to say, if we're ever down, I can measure lost revenue, lost opportunity against that thing. So we basically have to plan for never down, which if you don't live in those environments, maybe that seems like a real expectation. If you do live in them, it's kind of unexpected. And then on the other hand, we see these fantastically successful companies, albeit, maybe it's an Etsy or a Netflix or whatever, talking about hundreds of deployments a day, 10 deployments a day, whatever it is, the kind of the world of Gene Kim number of deployments. How have you found in talking to people that the folks that are pushing for more and more deployments because, again, they want to experiment, they want to validate things. How do they begin to kind of educate the people that are from the 5 nines world that don't really understand that the more small experiments you're doing, the better chance that you don't have of catastrophic failure?
Nicole Forsgren and Gene Kim and Jez Humble wrote a book called Accelerate that has some really great arguments in it about why going faster is safer. And the thing I say is when you're a kid and you're learning to ride a bike and your parent says, go faster and you won't fall down. And you're like, that makes zero sense to me. The pavement is very hard. I'm not going fast. What they know and you don't is that speed is in fact safety. And so frequently when I bring out these super like folksy, almost everyone has had these experiences where safer is faster. It kind of changes people's thinking, because if you do it as a purely technology thing, they learned this technology this way and they're not going to abandon it easily. When you take technology out of that realm and put it into a different context, it gives them an opportunity to rethink why it is that they're valuing stability. And I think another useful thing to say is everything's a little bit broken. Like we could be operating in a depreciated, a suboptimal state and still making money. Like maybe we're not serving all of the ads on our page, but we're still serving news. Like we're still providing value. Right. And so the emergency is less emergent because you're only kind of broken. You've isolated your parts enough so that you're not stuck with all or nothing.
Yeah, and I think I think what you highlight, and you've come back to this a couple times, is figuring out how to help people understand how to explain that. And like you said, sometimes you have to, even though you're dealing with a technical context, you've got to be able to explain it in some other frame of reference for somebody. So, like you said, if the person that you're trying to convince is a cyclist, you're explaining to them that, the second half of their ride, they're in pain, they're struggling, they're not in as good a shape as they were when they started, but at the same time, they're still completing the task, they're still participating, they're still doing their thing, and you can do that. But I think what you highlight is really important, which is you've got to realize that unless people really have the exact same experiences that you have to figure out some of their experiences and try and put it into their kind of their view of the world, if you will. And the bike riding example is really good.
One of the funny things is that one doesn't work in Europe because they don't train their kids on pedal bikes. They train them on coaster bikes. And so the kids manage steering and balance before they manage pedaling.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make any sense to Europeans.
Right. Yeah, and that is one of the challenges is you get these teams that are distributed teams and mixed teams, and you've also then got to realize, what are some of those cultural things that you take for granted that just don't exist where they are. I think that's really good. You have an interesting sort of line, and I'll read this. This is from one of your talks. It says, by adding error budgets, layered access, and other accommodations for failure, we're able to design our systems for function over pure, kind of form or purity. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those elements are? We talked a little about error budgets, layered access. What are some of these concepts that you're finding people are able to do to, keep the amount of brokenness, whether it's contained or whether it's, better ways to sort of manage it so that, like you said, we're trying to deal with function over purity?
One of the things that we found really useful for people is a pattern that we call the circuit breaker. So if you're consuming data from an API and you're monitoring the amount of data that's coming in, you're like, okay, the flow looks about right, within, these parameters. And suddenly you see like 100x spike. You have a pretty good guess that something has gone weird. Either they've changed a setting or you've changed a setting or you're getting DDoS'd somehow. There's something wrong. And you don't want to consume that possibly bad data and put it into your database. So your monitoring system trips a flag which turns off the inbound API until you have time to go figure it out. So there's not like millions of bad messages pouring into your system, you've turned it off and you can troubleshoot it. Now, that's a little broken because now you're not getting those messages anymore, but it's probably better than overwhelming your own system with a flood of bad messages.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great example. It's it's a little bit like you said. It's the example of a portion of your site or your app could be down, but it doesn't impact the thing that you immediately have. Right. It's sort of the example that people use about like Amazon.com. Amazon.com is never down, but you may not necessarily get the recommendations. You may not necessarily get the people like you also bought this, but they make sure that the site's there, the front page is there, maybe the shopping cart is always there, and the other pieces become, layered or chunks of that experience, but not the entire experience.
Right. And another thing that we promote really hard is what we call testing in production. And this makes all of the old school sysadmins just flinch because they're like, no, production is sacred. But here's the thing. No staging environment these days can be equivalent to production because it's so expensive and because our production services are so interconnected and we're depending on AWS and we're depending on Okta. And so there's all these things that are very hard to replicate in staging. You should still be doing integration testing. I'm not saying that. But there needs to be a way you can put something on production and then the layered access is we're going to turn it on in production, but only for the team that built it. Or only for internal beta users, or maybe only for this one customer who is, desperately needs this feature, but we're not sure that it's ready for full release. So you give people an option to configure what it's like to have production in a bunch of different states simultaneously.
Yeah, and I think, you point out a really important thing, which is, especially as we're dealing with systems that have to be available 24/7, 365, globally available. We're never necessarily sure when they have to scale or something's going to get really, really popular. It does make it nearly impossible to somehow replicate it in a dev and test environment or a QA environment. It sort of is one of those things that, again, you kind of have to go to an analogy. You take a professional football team preparing for the Super Bowl. You can't prepare for the actual Super Bowl, but maybe you can prepare for the noise by pumping in noise into where you practice, or you can work on the last 2 minutes of the game with high pressure by sort of creating that in a certain way, but you can't replicate the entire thing. And you have to figure out, how do you say, I can maybe replicate aspects of it or create scenarios in which we have to react, but you also have to have that mindset of, we can't believe that we're going to find everything exactly the way the world will be. But if we do it in parts and we design our system in parts, we have a better chance of success.
Exactly. And one of the things that I think is a great example of that is we do this all the time when we have car maintenance, where we're like, oh, I can change my own oil, or I can put oil in, but I can't change oil.
Right.
And so we have these like specialty roles where it unlocks for some people and not for others. The other problem is production is so weird. Like, user data is so weird that we do not correctly anticipate it. So you could either be using real data, which is a PII nightmare, or you can accept that you're going to catch the fact that in some languages, people only have 1 or 2 letter last names, or don't have last names, or have 3 last names. The number of ways Americans are terrible about recognizing international names is actually a whole talk.
Right. International names, international phone numbers, addresses, all sorts of stuff.
Yes. I tell people that what they have to do is build their system so that they are ready for the first children named in emojis. Because if you are ready for that, you are ready for now. Yeah. And emoji named children are coming.
Yeah. Or yeah, exactly. We've already seen it with Prince, and then it will just be, more and more and more. So yeah, no, it's the preparing for the unknown is so hard to do because, again, you just can't sometimes get your mind to a place where, how in the world would that ever happen? Or that series of events would ever happen? And again, I think it points out the fact that if you think you are going to deploy your application in a very controlled environment, maybe that sort of works. You're only going to be in the United States, but as soon as you want to get outside of that sort of known, you've got to start thinking, I've got to break this thing into parts because I can't have the entire thing breaking because I didn't know something, I didn't get to something.
Right. And we can test for known unknowns. Like I can say, hey, you need to check your names. But we might not be testing for things that we can't anticipate. Like unknown unknowns are the hardest part and why we have to test in production.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that was years and years ago. That was one of the great kind of aha moments for me was I got to talking to one of the developers. We were developing protocols and so forth. And I was like, why does it take you so long to do things? We know what the thing's supposed to look like. There's a spec for it. And, are you spending all of your time around the idea that people are going to do things wrong? You should. And he goes, yeah, that's exactly what I do. I spend 80% of my time having to come up with failure scenarios and how to deal with them in some graceful or ungraceful way. And otherwise, writing the code would be super easy if the world was always straight roads and everybody went the same speed.
Right. And I think that's one of the interesting things about APIs. And I'll be interested to see how it works with GraphQL, especially, is we can say, I don't care how you work as long as you return this thing. Like what's under that abstraction layer of the API, not my problem. I'm just consuming your data. And so as long as we can trust that contract, then all we have to do is test that contract. And somebody else is in charge of testing that their API is delivering the right thing.
Right.
And so not only at a company level, but in this trust web of what I call the yours, mine, and ours ecosystem, like with all of the microservices and services and software as a service, within that trust web, we have this promise theory that we're counting on people to deliver what they promised contractually. Right.
And you're never exactly sure, where is the technical boundary? Where is the legal boundary? Where is the, we sort of thought we meant that type of boundary as well.
Right. But it does mean that you can have a less chaotic expectation. Right. Because you're not the one who has to code it. Either it meets your standards for consumption or it does not meet your standards for consumption.
Right.
There's two states.
Yeah. No, that is the one nice piece of it. It's sort of like the service tells you what you can have or what you can't have. And once you take negotiation out of it, it does, you may not always like the outcomes, but it does make things much more expedient in terms of like you said, getting to either, yes or no.
Right. Which is why I think GraphQL will be super interesting because it is a negotiation to say, so I say that APIs, like REST APIs, are like a restaurant menu. You walk in and you look at it and you say, oh, of these things, this is the one I want. And GraphQL is more like one of the hipster bartenders in the mission, where you walk in and he says, what do you feel like today? And you're like, I don't know, something fruity. He's like, do you like mango? Right. Sure, I like mango. Yeah. And then you end up with a drink that's great, but it was not predictable.
Right, exactly. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and I sort of hit on it at the beginning, and again I'm going to come back to it just as we've talked about this. When you get a chance to speak to a lot of people, the great thing about that is, depending on what part of the world you're in or what you were talking about, you get feedback from people, and to a certain extent, people are trying to learn from you. They're trying to take something with it. Do you find that you're trying to teach people good practices at the same time you're having to sometimes give them examples that are, here's a disaster. Here's an example of a car wreck, kind of thing. Do you find that people resonate more to sort of the best practices and they can nod their head because, they're engineers and they're kind of structured in the way they think? Or do you find that they're like, you know what, I love that you gave me a real life car wreck because I can take that back to people and that'll be memorable. Like, have you found any patterns in terms of, which kind of storytelling or things like, examples tend to resonate more with people, or they come back to you and they'd say, this worked better in me trying to change something at my job?
Oh, everybody loves a good disaster talk. I will preferentially attend disaster talks because, again, it's so much easier to relate your concrete problem to something not abstract, but differently concrete. There's this really great book by Scott McCloud called Drawing Comics, where he points out that psychologically we identify more with a stick figure than we do with a realistic cartoon figure. And that's because we can project ourselves onto the stick figure. And if the cartoon doesn't look like us, then we don't identify ourselves with it. And I think that's a lot of why disaster talks and chaos talks are so exciting, because we can look at them and say, oh, I see the general outline of this system and how it failed, rather than, I don't know, Facebook gave a talk, but we're still like in a soap rest world and it doesn't do us any good.
Yeah, no, and I think there's just a certain human nature that's sort of built into our DNA, which is, somewhere between kind of apathy and, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And I always come back to people sometimes that go, well, the best way to do this is to start with the low hanging fruit and kind of do, and I'm like, that's great. And that works really well if you're kind of just updating your resume and you want to put some things on there. But if you want to get bigger buy-in, like you need to go look for car wrecks. You need to look for burning platforms, because those are the things that sometimes the people above you are like, if we don't fix this, I lose my job, or, we go out of business, or so like you can't be afraid of being like, I'm going to go near that third rail, because that's the ones where people will buy into your crazy idea, or they will throw a lot of money at it to go fix it. Sometimes the low-hanging fruit is, it's great for resume-driven development, but it doesn't necessarily get more than one person interested in what you think is a problem.
The third rail is where the power is.
Exactly.
And I think it's super interesting, because there are some times when you are standing there and you're like, this is on fire. Okay, it's not currently on fire, but it's a smoldering heap of greasy rags, and we will have a fire if you don't do something. And in that case, I think it's super useful to pull from somebody else's very similar disaster and say, hey, we know that Y2K was an enormous upgrade problem. I realize it seems like a long way away, but 2038 is coming, and are we thinking about that?
Yeah, and you have to convince people that, if they went through a lot of Y2K prepping and it didn't fail, that this isn't just another set of like crying wolf and so forth. So there's as much as technologists always love to talk bits and bytes, it's like, go back and get that undergrad minor in psychology and a little bit of marketing and other stuff, because you're going to have to convince somebody of something at some point. It's whether you call it storytelling or you call it whatever. So, well, very cool. Thank you so much. This has been a fun discussion. I like you said, I enjoy talking to people who, while they know the technology really well, also understand the human aspect of it. And you shared with us a lot about, how do we overcome some of these fears, which again are really, sometimes we do better when we're going faster.
Yeah. And good luck to everybody out there.
Yeah. Heidi, real quick, if folks, you're going to be giving a keynote and speaking like at Velocity in Berlin later in the year, but you speak all over the place. If people kind of want to pick your brain, reach out to you, what might be a good place for them to either, learn more about the things that you focus on, or, potentially reach out to you with a question or something?
If you have a question, probably it's fastest to at me on Twitter, @WiredFerret.
We have to figure out where does that come from? That's a unique name.
Well, okay. I would like to say that in 2007, none of us realized we'd be using these for our professional lives. I had ferrets and I was a little hyperactive.
All right. Simple as that.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. You're not doing any crazy experimentation with them.
No. Good. No, I am not experimenting. No pets are harmed in the production of feature flags.
Very cool. Yeah. So we will get your Twitter handle in the show notes. You have a fantastic blog that has all of your talks and so forth as videos, so people can go watch them. Heidi, thank you so much for the time today. We really enjoyed it. And folks, we hope you gained something from this, as we always try and balance between throwing new technologies at you and then hopefully helping you figure out how to get them implemented, or getting your teams to rally around some of these things. So for Heidi, thank you so much for the time today. I want to thank both DigitalOcean and PricingWire for sponsoring today's show. It's easy to learn more about PricingWire and book a strategy session at PricingWire.com. So with that, we're going to wrap it up. We want to thank everybody for listening every week. We want to thank everybody for telling a friend, for rating the show and sharing it on iTunes and all the other places. And with that, we're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.